Welcome, fellow wizards, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. Today we have Pat Naoum talking about realism versus stylization in your indie video games.
The Indie Game Lunch Hour.
In our live magical podcast, we give game developers the chance to hear stories of breaking in from industry experts, as well as directly ask them questions about their areas of expertise in the second half of each episode. This is an unedited recording of a weekly event we host on our Discord on Wednesdays at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, so feel free to swing by and join us for the next one and ask your own questions live. As always, I'm your host, Willem Delpenthal, headmaster of the Indie Game Academy and the Wizard of Joy! And joining me today is Pat Naoum. Pat, also known as Pat the Pat, an indie game developer and the creator of The Master's Pupil, is a really interesting, I believe, solo developer, but we're going to talk about that in a bit. Creating The Master's Pupil, a fascinating game that uses real-life painting as the art style. So Pat, welcome to our podcast. What are you having for lunch today?
Today I'm having roast potatoes and a Greek salad because it is dinner time in Greece. So, when in Rome, eat as the Romans do, or when in Greece, eat as the Greeks do, I guess. So, yeah.
I've become lost, but yes.
Just a metaphor.
It sounds delicious. That's one of the better answers. Usually people will say like coffee and some yogurt at best. Amazing. Well, welcome, Pat. It's so lovely to have you on the podcast. I think maybe Jess, our community manager, saw some posts of yours or saw your game and wound up putting us in contact, and now here you are. Lovely to welcome you on the show. Absolutely.
Lovely to be here. Thanks so much.
Heck yeah. So where we usually start in this podcast to give all of us some perspective into who you are, Pat, is to ask for your origin story. So tell us how you got started with video games and how you got to where you are now.
It's a long one, but I'll keep it snappy. Is that it's basically I started with creative arts. I did a Bachelor of Creative Arts, and then I went to film school, so I was going kind of like down that road. And then I realized that making film is quite it's difficult, but then you also have to compromise quite a lot. So then I basically kind of switched gear and just started making what would be the Master's Pupil. And that's my first game, really. So I started making that, and it's been about 7 years in the making. And it's released like 2 months ago now. And so,
congrats.
Thank you. And yes, it was a long process, mainly because I hand painted it. So yes, we can talk about that when we talk about texture and realism versus not. But basically, yeah, there's a kind of a long process really to get here. But basically, I'm kind of a new dev, even though I've been doing it for like 10 years or so.
Yes, I feel the same way. Also, everybody knows, famously, video games are very quick to produce, and you never need to compromise on your vision. So
exactly.
It makes a lot of sense.
Just straight through, yeah.
Amazing. Well, it's I think in particular the piece of your game that is going to be the most interesting to users, and the reason we decided on this stylization versus realism talk is the hand painted aspect of it. As always with indies, a unique art style is one of the really strong hooks that can bring in an audience. So tell me, I guess let's just start with a little bit more about the game. So tell me what the Master's Pupil is, and then how you wound up getting to this hand painted art style.
Well, basically, yes, the Master's Pupil is a puzzle game set inside Claude Monet's eyeball. So it actually you run across the iris of the actual eye and over his kind of life. Yeah, and it's kind of a strange idea I had very early on, before the idea of painting it came in. And then when I decided that this game should be over someone's life and in their iris, I thought maybe Claude Monet would be a good person to base this game around, because a little bit of a spoiler, but he has cataracts later on in his life. So set in an iris, like in an actual eyeball, with this cataracts being the big bad of the game. And then I thought, well, that's a good excuse to use my creative arts degree and actually put my painting to good use. And I can actually paint the thing and try and mimic as much as I can his style, that changed kind of over his lifetime. So that kind of style kind of came with the idea of a game set in an eye and over someone's life, basically.
That is super fascinating. It's giving me Psychonaut vibes. Like,
Yes, yeah, totally, yeah. It kind of an abstract world, especially because Psychonauts is that kind of like when we're talking about realism versus stylization. It's like how do you
Mhm.
create this world that doesn't exist in real life, but you need to bring in elements of real life. Creating a world like that and using stylization is like the best tool in my mind. That's kind of why I wanted to talk about it today. Was because there's so much about those two dynamics and how they play together that kind of creates this. It creates the world more than anything else for me, anyway.
Amazing. I think I would love to hear, I guess, the pipeline maybe for that art. So first of all, there's many different types of painting. So tell us about the painting itself, and then how does that wind up going through the process of actually getting in the game?
So it's real paint on real paper. That was the kind of like, I did these tests really early on where I scanned in these kind of actual real acrylic paint. I decided not to go full oils like Claude Monet because that would have just stunk out my whole house, and I wouldn't have been able to do that. And I actually made them quite small as well, so that these like tiny little paintings. So I didn't again fill up my whole house with not stink this necessarily, but like just space and have giant canvases everywhere. So I set up these kind of these tiny little A4 paintings full of different game parts, and then literally hand painted them, scanned them in with a film negative scanner, and then load them into Unity. And so it was this very kind of laborious process, but in terms of actually making, if I were to do it all, like recreate it all digitally somehow, like there was all this like detail and texture that you really can't achieve without with digitally. I had to kind of do it live with actual textures and then scan it in. But yeah, it was a very long process of like kind of essentially building all the levels in Unity, taking screenshots of the actual pieces, putting them into Photoshop as printing them out, then painting over the top of them so they would be exact, and then scanning them in and putting them back in. And of course, like years later, when I went to port it, I got this company called Noble Seed Games. They're fantastic, and they ported it to Switch, and I sent them the game file, and I had something like 50 gigs of just of just high resolution scans, and I was just sorry guys, and they just said this is ridiculous. You need to go through and like cull all these like stray wild. Too many pixels, essentially, just way too many pixels. Go and cut them out. So yes, yeah, a long process.
Amazing. I can tell, and I say this with all the love of my heart. I don't throw shade, as most most of my listeners know. I can tell that you're a solo developer because that just sounds like the most ridiculously inefficient process.
Yeah. Just paint everything, and like later on in the game, the background levels, I established a kind of like tile system where I could use like the background layers. Sorry, these like parallax effect I had going on. I developed this kind of like modular system where I could make these vines, which are the kind of the central ground of the game. I made those into the background so they worked as this modular system, but I had already established this like piece by piece, doing all these individual pieces where the ground where the player runs on, they were all by hand, each individual. Like there was no modular system, there was no cheating. I just literally hand painted everything. Yes, very very inefficient. Exactly.
Amazing. I mean, but that's also sort of the glory of game development. And I think of solo development. Back in the day, if anybody remembers this software, you get major kudos points. Back in the day, one of my first like game engines, I guess, that I used was called Sawblade Software, which was a Mac exclusive, which, first of all, everybody knows that's an incredible business decision, that allowed you to make platformer games. And I didn't really have any understanding of like game development pipelines or art pipelines. So I actually did something very similar, only I'm less artistic than you, so it looked terrible. I hand drew with colored pencils a bunch of characters in pieces and then imported them and then
Right.
created my own sprite sheet by animating those little pieces of the characters and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
took those all out and made a sprite sheet and then imported that into Solid Blade software. And it took like 20 hours, maybe not 20 hours. It took a long time per character. But
That's
it was
so
also pretty
good.
cool. It was like a very unique art style. It was a lot of fun.
Well, there's, the system works. If it make it, you can make something quite interesting looking out of just jamming stuff together. It always works.
Amazing. So tell me, I think the other part about this that's really interesting is the solo development. Solo dev is this. I feel like I see two sides of the meta perspective on solo development. There's the one side that says like solo development is unrealistic or too difficult or is a bad. And then there's the other side that I think I would say is probably the more common perspective that views solo development as this like glorious thing held in like high regard, like wow, they're a solo developer. So I'm curious, where on that spectrum you fall first of all, and then what your journey has been like as a solo developer.
I don't think I'm the one to say whether where I am on that spectrum because I also did all the advice that you get as a solo dev early on is like nothing too big, nothing too long, as quick as you can and get it out. And I
Yeah.
ignored that entirely. Like it literally took me 7 years from when I started making this game to now, to releasing it. And even I came up with the idea about 10 years ago, so it was 3 years before I actually got into the actual mechanics and started making stuff. But I think I not cheated, but I kind of got my way through the scenario because I really like the process of art making and creating. So for me, it was just a process of like little bits at a time, creating and just chipping away at this like giant thing. Because, it was, I think, little thing that's not talked about really, or a big thing that's not talked about in a lot of like indie game kind of podcasts or what have you is like that the hardest thing about indie dev is having to like eat and pay rent while you do it. Because if I could just stop and then just make the game, it probably would have taken me 3 years, maybe less. Had I know what I was doing, maybe even less than that. But I had to just, I had to have a day job and work and like pay rent. So there's this kind of awkward thing where the first 3 years, I say 7 years, but it's the first 3 years were like weekends and weekdays and, the occasional day off. And then after 3 years of that and like learning how to code and doing all that, and then I spent another, 4 years or 3 years after that of like, part-time work. I would because I'm a freelance graphic designer as well, so I just stopped work at like midday and then just started working. At the start, it started at like 4 p.m. and then it just reduced down to like lunchtime. And I was like, "No, I'm done with this. I'm gonna do the game." But that's a big financial hit. You have to actually cop that. And like, I started getting paid essentially part-time. Half my wage. And then, I was lucky enough to apply and get the Australian Screen Australia grant for, the first time that they did games grants. And I applied and got that. That was, almost a year and a half ago now. So I applied and got that, and that kind of allowed me to go full time and allowed me to port it to Switch. And so, yeah, there's this kind of strange journey for me that was. I don't know how normal it is for indie devs because it's just like I did this process where I thought this is my way of being able to actually physically do this in my life, realistically do this in my life because I think there's a lot of devs that just go like, yeah, no, I just have a rich dad or I, have a rich partner that was able just to fund me while I could do this. So it's a process I think, and it's a tough one for sure.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I often recommend to my students that they don't do solo dev.
Right.
But the reason I do that is because I know the majority of them are seeking or aiming for gainful employment sometime in the nearest future. And so if you're trying to put together a portfolio in particular, and if you're trying to release games in less than 7 years, once again with all the love. I think team development is important, but at the same time, there's like so much joy, first of all, coming out of you. And then I think you also have a lot of really interesting perspectives and sort of your own solutions to problems. And that's something that I think solo development gives you that team development can't.
Yeah, and for me, it was always this idea of compromise, not necessarily
Mhm.
about my artistic pursuit. Of course, that was always part of it. It's like, you want to kind of have uh, your ideas untainted, even though you have to compromise all the time with what you're doing, with what you're creating and how you're creating it. But for me, it was a compromise. I didn't want to slow other people down because I was
Mhm.
learning how to do this. I had come from an entirely different space. I had no idea how to design a game. I had no idea how to code. I didn't know had idea how to like do sound in games and all this kind of stuff. So I didn't want to kind of be like, here's my idea and this is what I want to do, and then just drag all these other people into it and have them kind of create it. I wanted to try and learn all this stuff myself, and so I didn't have to compromise with other people being better than me. So it's like, or having to kind of be faster to like keep up with people that were better than me, because anyone at that stage when I started was better at game design or game development or what have you. So for me, it was that process. I don't know what it is. The other side of what compromise is. I guess it's a two-sided thing anyway. But yeah, it
Yeah.
was always that process for me that enabled
Mhm.
me to kind of, because I could just take my time, and that's why it took 7 years. Was because I
Mhm.
was just chipping away and doing my thing. Because I didn't have any other options. I didn't come through a school. I didn't come through uni. I just did it, and that's how long it took me, and that's the best way I found how to do it. Because yeah, I like all the parts, and for me, the pros of solo dev is you get to do everything yourself, and then the cons of solo dev is that you have to do everything yourself. So yeah, there's always two sides.
Yeah, I love it. Just Do It, originally credited to Pat Naoum. You heard it here first. Um, let's talk then about the topic of the day, which is stylization versus realism. A lot of indie games rely on stylization for two very important reasons. One, because you can often make your game actually easier to put together by stylizing. If anyone remembers this, the era of games on the Wii, so many Wii games were stylized because, frankly, that console couldn't handle realistic graphics, so they stylized it instead. On the other hand, though, realism is something that we've come to expect in especially AAA titles, and is something we've come to sort of associate with like quality. This is a high quality game because they made it so realistic.
Mhm.
So I would love to get your 101, the introduction to realism versus stylization, and how you recommend we use it as indie devs.
Cool. Okay. I haven't planned anything for this, so it's a bit off the cuff. But let
Perfect.
me think, because it is kind of like it's an interesting concept, and I brought it up originally with you guys because it's just such a. I find it's something that is kind of over. People look at it as a kind of one or the other, because there's the obvious version of this, which is like the way something looks. COD versus, I don't know, Zelda. You have a stylized thing versus a realistic thing. But I think there is something much more interesting to be talked about, at least in the spectrum of how that affects gameplay, how that affects the way you interact with this world. Because as soon as you have realism, you have expectations. So for
Mhm.
me, realism and expectations are combined. What I wanted to do with the Master's Pupil in stylizing it and moving it away from realism is that at no point in playing this game are you expecting something. Everything that you do when you start interacting with the game is something because you are not expecting what's going to happen. You're just interacting with what's there and then learning as you go. I played, for example, I like to play the Far Cry games with no HUD, right? I love those games. I jump in there and I usually turn off all the HUD. But I hadn't played one for a while when I think number 5 came out. And I was like, I don't want to play with the HUD. I'm going to turn it all off. And then I ran out into this world and I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I was just bouncing off walls. I didn't know I could pick up weapons. Like, there was no sense of like, I knew that I could pick up a weapon, but I kind of forgot how, and I didn't know what was a weapon and what wasn't. And so I was running around in a realistic world, expecting something. Obviously, I had kind of moved away from what the designers had set up for me, but I was kind of like expecting something and not really getting it. Eventually, I turned some things on. Um, but then you have this expectations about how doors work, how windows work, how even the fact that there is doors and windows in something. And so I think, the example that I gave was everything from COD to Zelda, but Zelda is almost in the middle, where you're still in a realistic world, so to speak, there's still fantasy elements, but then you're still in this zone of what is still a person running in an environment. And then I don't know what would be on the very far end spectrum. Maybe something like Thomas is Alone, was Alone, because that's a game of just cubes and just shapes, and you're in this entirely abstracted world that is far, far removed from realism. You have gravity. I can't think of anything else in that game that is like a realistic thing that you have. And so, yes, maybe that's a kind of broad kind of schmear over what my 101 of realism versus style is. But for me, it's much broader than just the look of a game. It can also go into the mechanics of the game and even down to the feel of what a game is. So it's very broad for me.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating perspective. I think what I feel like I'm getting out of it is that your game has a gameplay pillar. I would love to hear if this is right. Has a gameplay pillar or opinion that the world should be more abstracted and more like ethereal. I'm once again getting Psychonauts vibes. Like the world has fewer rules. Zelda may not look realistic, but Zelda still happens in a tangible world with real rules. I fall, I get hurt by bombs, I have a certain number of arrows. And so too stylized of a graphic set may not match that expectation from the players of this, ruled world. Versus your game
Yeah.
in a game like Psychonauts or Thomas Was Alone is a little bit more sort of about the mental experience, and so therefore the stylization matches that pillar. Does that feel like
Yeah.
about right?
Yes, kind of. I guess my pillar was much simpler than that because for Master's Pupil, it was always about the puzzles. The puzzles came first. And I had this idea of it, like I said earlier, like a game set in an eyeball. The game set in this like micro level about, you know, uh, in a world that nobody really understands. It's like you can look at it in a microscope, but if you're going to set a game in there, I can kind of make it up. So I could have made this game I could have had other characters. I could have had it more humanoid, the character that you play as, and had this kind of, I could have set a full RPG in there and had it kind of, based on a lot of things about, Monet's life and what have you. But I wanted to make a puzzle game because it was something that I could construct, something that I understood. I'd come off I first had this idea around when like Braid and Limbo were coming out. So that's what I was kind of aiming for. That's what I kind of loved. And so for me, it was about how can I best serve the puzzles? So, and serve the game, therefore serve the game. So for me, it was this way of how can I have that Mario level 1 kind of idea of just jumping into a level and interacting with what's there and having you kind of what's the term for it? I don't know, like experience what is in front of you rather than kind of having expectation and trying to work out what's there. So for me, it was always about serving the puzzles rather than kind of something much broader. And and that to me is the kind of the next step of this kind of realism versus stylized thing is because if you, for no apparent reason, decide to make your game realistic and realist, then you're giving the player all these expectations about what they can and can't do. Like you were saying, you have a certain amount of arrows, bombs hurt you. Can things light on fire? If there is a fire, if you throw that at something wooden, you have the expectation that that's going to burn. So then, as a dev, you then have to create that. You have to make sure that your houses can burn, and then you have to make sure that things can fall over. You have to make sure that you can run out of arrows, or that bombs hurt you, or that kind of thing. But if you make a game abstractly that is heavily stylized, you get to decide what is real and not. And you get to decide what is your realism, what is your world. And so it's very different from a world building of like, yeah, there's dragons and it's a medieval landscape with wizards and spells. Your world building from the very like fabric of the way the physics of the game works. So, is there fire? Is there water? How do these things interact? Or are they not in the game at all? And what does that mean for the way that the game works? So it's not only broadening the idea of stylism versus realism, but how that affects the very world that you're creating in.
I'm loving how this is implying a bunch of different lenses that we're looking at the stylization. So the first one is just the visual. You wanted this world to look interesting, and you wanted to just experiment with a new visual art style, or to you, an old one that you were already comfortable with. Then from gameplay, which as a designer, this is the one that sort of like makes the most sense to me, I have the most context for. There's a lot that stylization seems to imply. Largely, you're breaking players out of expectations by stylizing. Because I think almost like they're put in a world that they have less reference for because it is stylized.
Yeah,
and then
exactly
number three,
right.
yeah, and number three, another lens is almost like the business perspective. You mentioned Braid and Limbo, which I totally get vibes from for this game. It's almost, and I don't know if this was intentional, it's almost like you went, okay, I'm building a game that's going to hit a similar audience to these two games. These two games are heavily stylized. I better stylize in my own way too.
Yeah, in a way, because I think if you make another game that is real or stylized in a certain way, like pixel art is a great example. Even if you can have a really amazing pixel art game, but you're still going to be lumped in with all the other pixel art games. And so if you have a game that is stylized and artistically unique and different, it's going to stand out. Like the Master's Pupil is its success, small success has been this kind of held on the fact that it was painted, and painting takes a long time, and this process took a long time. So the success I found on social media before the game came out was just entirely about that it was painted and that it looked like this, because no other games really have this kind of look. And so the stylization as uniqueness is massively important, and it's massively part of like what my like marketing and branding was from the very beginning. And it wasn't necessarily like I'm going to paint a game and so then it will sell well. It was more like, what are the pros and cons of certain styles, and how does the style of a hand painted impressionist game, what boxes does that tick? And it going like, well, yes, actually this is quite unique, and it will look, if it looked like this, then it will, not necessarily it will sell like this, but it will apply or appeal to this audience or this group of people. So yeah, I think that's what makes, I think, game dev very interesting in a really broad kind of ways. Is like how these different things are kind of you know how your decisions while designing something can affect all parts of it, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm getting Will Wright vibes here. There's the Will Wright's famous perspective that you as the developer are actually creating your game for two different engines. The first engine is the one you actually program it in, but the second one is just the human mind. Your game is only what the human actually interprets it to be.
Yeah, at the end of
Ultimately.
the day, there's the hardware of someone's hands and their eyeball,
Yeah.
and so they have
Yeah.
to be the person. They have to be the thing that's interacting with. And like,
Yeah.
puzzle design comes into all of that as well. Maybe that's for a different podcast entirely, but like, there is this sense of there is a sense of like having to design for people and how they're going to react with something. Because bringing it back to the realism thing is like, again, there's that's what it comes down to, that expectation, how the person is going to interact with the game and interact with the symbols and the design of the game, and how they're going to experience it. Because you can make a game entirely out of icons. You look at something like the first like adventure games, they were like, or the first rogue games, like they were just like the like symbols on a screen. And so how do and then you can have full Zelda style RPGs and dungeon crawlers. The two of those are very different experiences, but they're talking about the same thing. So if you can have that kind of spread, what spread can you have for, an RTS or a first-person shooter or whatever? If you're making a game and you have an idea about it, may be centered in a mechanic or it may be centered in a world that you want to create. It's like, what style are you choosing for that? It may not necessarily be what's obvious. It could just be something that applies to everything that you want the game to be. And it could be something completely different and utterly weird. And in my opinion, that's always the best way, is because you're then getting players to suddenly interact with something that is unique and different. And it's not something that they are expecting, and you get to use that. You're not having to play into their, previous expectations. I keep on coming back down to expectations, and I love it. I love that word so much.
Amazing. You just gave me like a super fascinating vision of a hand painted first person shooter, like maybe a Doom clone where
Yeah,
everything's
yeah.
everything's billboarding towards you and you're like blowing up enemies and little pieces of acrylic paint. Yeah. All right, so it is time to jump into community questions. Rick, as always, is our primary question asker. Rick, would you like to start with your first question there?
Yeah, so I love that you've got a unique art style on your game, and it sounds like you've put a lot of emphasis on it. But I'm also wondering how you approached your user experience in the gameplay. Like, how did you figure out what you wanted the gameplay to be for the players?
Awesome question, and thanks, Rick. Because it is that was something that was in hand for me with that kind of expectation idea. Because there was this idea of I wanted this game because a lot of my friends and family don't play games, so I wanted a game that everyone could play, and that again kind of fed into that idea, like, and this is like long-term thinking when I was early on, right? Which is like, well, if I make a game really broad and easy to play, then a lot of people can play it. And then on top of that, I was kind of thinking, well, I don't want to. I loved how Limbo had no text, and I didn't really like how Braid had a lot of text. So I wanted to kind of have a game that had no text and had no kind of narration, say, telling you what to do. And so my user experience was to try and drip feed everything to the user or the player so they would not be lost, or they would not be kind of and you'd want to do that all the time with games, but it's much easier with a linear puzzle game because you know where they are in their story or their like idea of how the game functions, so you can drip feed them everything. And so for me, it was all about the drip feed, and it was really focused. The example I can give is the very first level of the very first puzzle at the very first level. The Master's Pupil only has like 3 buttons: left, right, and jump. And so the first thing you come across is a scary looking spiky thing underneath a platform. And so there's a little bump just before the platform. And so the whole idea was just to go, you can jump in this game. That exists. There's no there was it's a tutorializing basically just mechanics. And then later on, all the puzzles and all the mechanics that are like layered into that. And so for me, it was, drip feeding and then tutorializing literally anything and everything in the game.
Did you figure out what you needed to tutorialize with playtesting with people?
I really only playtested the game heavily with about, I think it was 7 people at the end of the day. I did do a lot of playtesting and quality control later on, but early on it was just the idea of for me it was about very simple design principles about introducing one thing at a time and having the player knock up against something. And I did have to come up with a lot of I had this kind of list of puzzles all mapped out one after another, making sure that they fed into one another and made sense in a linear kind of idea. The game features color mixing and complementary colors and that kind of thing, and having you kind of mix colors. And so I think I took a lot of that for granted as well. And so early on, I had to introduce really, really basic puzzles that kind of showed you exactly what was happening with the color mixing, because I showed a bunch of my, the people that played all the way through it, and I essentially, the playtesters were like there, and I sat over their shoulder and I just watched them play the game like for 5 hours, So it was this very like laborious like playtesting where I was kind of like, and then I'd kind of chime in with a few questions, or I'd just be monitoring what they got stuck on and what they were doing. So yeah, it was this long process, but it was just the idea of mapping out that kind of like really, one thing at a time, slowly but surely, basically.
Cool.
I
Thank you.
I want to jump back to the stylization for a moment again. Rick has more questions to ask, so I'm gonna I'm gonna do one here to break them up a bit. I'm curious, like for those who are considering stylization, maybe they're listening to some of the thoughts you have on it, and they're like, "Ooh, yeah, I think that could be right for my game." Tell me, give me your perspective on which games or perhaps which teams should be stylizing. Like, when is stylization of your art style and gameplay, for that matter, the appropriate solution?
Oh man, anyone, everyone. Like, I think there's a staleness at the moment with AAA games. Like I mentioned Far Cry before. Like, like what they start fiddling with, the area of play is like between, like, it's just a story. It's like literally those games are the same, and then they tweak things and they make them better. They add maybe another kind of elaborate mechanic that's just essentially a weapon you can fire in different ways, and then they just have another story. And the whole game is a linchpin on whether that story will play out, is fun or not. But the game is essentially the same thing over and over again. But AAA games have to do that. They have to be, like you're saying, it's a quality thing, right? They have to be real, and they have to kind of, like they're aiming for the masses, so they need to be able to sell millions of copies. So they need to make it, this broad. But for an indie dev, it's like they should be doing something that is interesting, because then the more unique it is, the more people will play it down the line, because it gets bigger and it gets more attention. So I think it's everyone, and like Nintendo seem to be doing it really well. Every time they come up with a new mechanic, they design a world around it and then use that as the, like, even though it looks realistic, but it's still heavily stylized. Like the squid, what are they called? Splatoon? Is it Splatoon? Yeah, where you
Splatoon.
squirt. Yeah, right. Where you squirt the stuff on the ground and then you can swim through it to recharge the stuff that you can squirt. Right. That was a mechanic they developed, and then they developed the squid people around that. And I was like, that is, like, when I first heard about that, I just thought that's like such great design. And Nintendo are full of that. Like, all the stuff that they do is constantly that way. But I would love to see some more stylization happening from the AAA front. Is like, they tried to do it, like Far Cry tried to do it, Ubisoft tried to do it with Far Cry New Dawn. I think that was a bit more stylized, but it was just kind of, they just added more color to it. And they tried to do it with the, like, but that's a different kind of world. The primal one, the like, that was set with
Primal.
yeah,
Far Cry
primal, right? Yeah, yes. I was wondering why that was popping in. But yeah, so I would love to see some bigger things, bigger names do it, because I think, I like Breath of the Wild is a great example, because you're reducing your scope down and then enabling the world to be much more richer because of that. And so, I think even like, is it Borderlands? I think the original Borderlands was like hyper realistic, and then they reduced it down. They stylized it so it would be this certain feel and style. And I think that's just like a great example of why those decisions can go really well. Basically, it doesn't matter how big you are, essentially.
Awesome. I love that as an answer. It sounds like the answer is like, maybe if you're AAA and you're trying to hit this mass wide audience, like maybe not stylized, but for basically everything else, stylization is a welcome feature.
Yeah, and because it's not something that is necessarily like, I can't think of a good, like, like Gran Turismo, or like a hyper realistic racing game. You know, you're still not expected to get out of the car. And so like there is a type of there's layers of what stylized can mean. And so even if you do have a realistic looking game, it's just like you were saying before, right? It's a lens. It's like how do you if you're looking at this in stylization versus realism, then that might not just be the look of it. It could be the lens of how you focus on mechanics or anything really.
Amazing. Okay, I think I hear. Oh yeah. That sound means it's the time for the question of the day, where we reiterate one of the most important things we learned from Pat. So get your fingers on your keyboard. The first person to correctly answer this question in the chat gets a House Cup point. Wow. Question is, why do we stylize our game from the lens of game mechanics? Why do we stylize our games from the lens of game mechanics? First person to type it gets a House Cup point. If you're listening, speak it out loud for us. That helps the lessons sink in further. I see Pizza Face and Rick typing. Who will win? Less processing power? That's real, but that would be from like a tech perspective. Yes, Rick gets it. To break expectations. We stylize because we get less expectations from the player in a world that is not pre-established. In a realistic world, we're going to have things that we expect to happen, like things lighting on fire when we use a torch. In a stylized world, the rules haven't been set yet because we haven't been in this world yet. Love that. All right, we've got time for probably one more question, maybe two. Rick, do you want to ask another one of yours?
Yeah, so the release of your game is a big decision. What are some things that are crystal clear in hindsight of your release that you wish you knew as you approached it?
Nice. Good question.
It's crystal clear is a strong term for for how I view the last 7 years. I think I did a whole lot of things well, and then I'm not even sure of the things I did badly because I feel like even in hindsight, some mistakes are like I have no idea because the game went way better than I was expecting. So I I was kind of like basically uh like this game has gone much better than I had thought of, and so I'm kind of like, well, I ticked the box, right? I did the game that I wanted to make, and it's done well, and now I'm happy and I'm good, right? But I think there is a strange amount of stuff I could have done better. I think in the long run, because like marketing is this thing that is just this dark art that you have to do later at the end of after you've done everything. You can get to the end of the game and you've completed it all, and then you have to start marketing, and it is awful. Like it's not a great thing to do. So I think learning how to do that early on and learning the way that works, I think is really really essential. And like we discussed a little bit, is that so much of the way indie game works is like, well, so much what I did early on was make these kind of like random choices with a marketing idea, and that was something that I think I did well, or that I'm looking back on, I'm going like, oh, that was really convenient. That I thought, well, maybe I should focus on uniqueness in style rather than going with something that is tried and true. Pixel art, for example. I could have just made a pixel game and gone down that path because I knew it was right, rather than making something weird and unique. And I don't think it would have gone as well. So it's deciding early on that, or making sure that marketing is a useful thing early on. I think that was and trying to understand that process and like the black box of the way social media works, and trying to be on top of that, because it's a whole different ball game. And I think specifically to maybe answer your question as just a useful thing, do screen recordings when you're making a game. Just make a whole library of just assets of what the game looks like in various times, because that is gold later on. Showing your journey on social media is like, it's like crack for Instagram. They love that. It is just this process of being able to kind of create this library that you can use later on. Yeah. So I think to answer your question specifically, I think it is marketing is something I could have done better. Something that I did fairly well, but it was luck more than anything. So yeah, marketing definitely.
That second piece of advice that you gave, though, to record your process, like, even if it doesn't go anywhere, is such good advice.
Yeah, it's so useful.
So useful. I was just looking back through all of my pictures from my time working at Lumosity, which was my first industry job, trying to find pictures of some of my paper prototypes, because that's a workshop we teach frequently, and we're submitting a GDC talk about it this year. And I found a couple. I got lucky. But, if I had just, like, spent the time to snap a picture of each one of them, like, it would be so nice to have right now. You never know when you're going to use that stuff, let alone, of course, for marketing.
And for me, I'm like a terrible, like I was saying before, when I submitted the game and it was like 50 gigs and I wheedled it down to like 7, like I had such bad practices. And one of those was like not version control. I just developed the game in one, like it was like one Photoshop file, and I just kept messing with it, and I never made any saves or backups or anything. And I never had, like, even when I went back to like what the game looked like in like a gray box, I never had a gray box version of the game. All I had is just like the end product. It was just layers and layers of just developing on top of each other, which is just terrible. And so again, I had no way of going back and recording things. So yeah, terrible.
Amazing. All right, so we are at the end of the episode. Now, we always do 2 things here at the end. The first one is to ask for a homework assignment, Pat. So we've talked about a lot of different things here, largely stylization versus realism. So what is something that the listener can do in the next week to put into practice or continue to learn some of what we talked about?
I think it's just a thought experiment of like, pick some of your favorite games and switch up the style, and how is like the game now better or worse or somewhere in between. It's like, if you made Far Cry as a top-down RTS, or as a what games can work like Thomas was alone? Like, how do you boil down a shooter into like squares? That for me is like an interesting process, because it's like, I don't think a lot of people think through the options. I think they just kind of go, well, I'm making X game, so it needs to be X style. And they don't think of like, well, a style can also be a tool to explain things and to help the player and to help the story. And so how do those things interact,
Amazing. I just had a random idea. Here, I'm going to modify this the tiniest bit. So I love this. Take a game that you really love, maybe do this for 2 or 3 games, and come up with a new possible style. If you've got the chops, maybe mock that up or Photoshop it or something like that. And then here's the new part. I want to see you post this to social media under the hashtag IGLH homework. Why don't we just like start doing that? That'll be fun.
Yes.
All right.
That would be amazing. It's great fodder for Mid-Journey, actually. That is just like, hey,
there you go.
For me. Yeah.
What does Legend of Zelda look like in the style of, I don't know, what's a really weird one? Stained
What's
glass.
the one? Yeah. Exactly.
Amazing. All right, so end of the episode. Before we say goodbye, is there any last messages you want to give to the audience, and anything you would like to plug, sir?
Plugging. Look, the Master's Pupil. Go and get it and tell me what you think of it. But join the Discord. I've got a Discord too. There's people speed running it, which has been this like weird experience. There's people playing it. Just say hello on social media. I'm on anything at Pat Naoum Games. That last name is a doozy to spell, but I'm sure there's notes somewhere in the podcast, and you can just see my name in the thread if you're here live. Pat Naoum Games. I'm on kind of everything, and I'm around. And from next week, I'm back making my new game, so I'll be on social media more, and somewhat done with the holiday part of these travels, but I'm still going and making games as I go. So say hi and introduce yourself, and play my game.
Amazing. So we'll put links down below to join the Masters Pupil Discord, to get the game on Steam, and maybe one of your social media links. This has been a lovely conversation, Pat. Thank you so much for being here and for answering our questions. Thank you, question askers, Rick, for asking questions today. And thank you, listeners, for listening. As always, if you enjoyed the episode, we ask that you think of one person who would enjoy this episode and send it along to them for us. All right. Goodbye, Pat. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much. Thank you.